My vengeful family called me a beggar. Then I revealed I owned their entire celebration. My name is Elizabeth Carter. I'm 32 years old, and for most of those years I've been invisible. Or worse, a disappointment. My story isn't about shouting or fighting. It's about silence. The kind of silence you learn when no one is listening. Before I tell you how everything flipped, like in subscribe, drop a comment where, are you watching from I was standing in the glittering ballroom of the Rosemont Hotel. The air smelled like money. Mix of expensive perfume, lilies, and champagne. Chandeliers dripped light onto the polished marble floor. I wore my best navy dress. It was simple, well-made, and probably the most expensive piece of clothing I owned. To everyone else here, it probably looked like a thrift store find. My sister, Vanessa, was the star of the show. It was her engagement party. I was standing near the back, trying to look like I belonged, when my father's voice cracked across the hall like a whip. He was holding a glass of champagne, his face flushed with pride and alcohol. He had just finished a toast to Vanessa and her fiancé, Mark. Then he saw me. His smile tightened. He pointed his glass in my direction, not even trying to be discreet. Get this beggar out. His voice wasn't a whisper. It was a pronouncement, loud enough for half the room to hear. A ripple of quiet laughter followed. The music seemed to dip for a moment. My mother, standing beside him in a shimmering silver gown, turned her head away, a small, pained smile fixed on her face as if she hadn't heard a thing. My sister Vanessa just smirked, a flicker of triumph in her eyes. My cousins, huddled together near the extravagant ice sculpture, started whispering, their hands cupped over their mouths. A young security guard in a stiff black suit took a hesitant step toward me. He looked confused, his eyes filled with a kind of pity that was almost worse than the scorn. He saw a woman in a plain dress being humiliated by a rich man. He didn't know the truth. None of them did. But they were about to. For as long as I can remember, my family had a story about me, and they told it to anyone who would listen. The story was that I was the family burden, the quiet one, the unsuccessful one, the one who just couldn't get her life together. It started when we were kids. Vanessa was the pretty one, the popular one. She got straight A's without trying, was the lead in every school play, and had a line of friends calling the house at all hours. I was the shy one with my nose in a book. I got good grades too, but mine were the boring, predictable kind. They didn't come with applause or trophies. My parents would praise Vanessa for her effortless charm. They would look at me and say, Elizabeth is a good girl, so quiet. It wasn't a compliment. It was a label for someone who didn't shine. As we grew up, the story hardened. Vanessa went to a big-name university, joined the best sorority, and majored in communications. She was preparing for a life in the spotlight. I went to a state school and studied finance and economics. My father, who ran a small but successful consulting firm, would pat me on the shoulder and say, good, solid choice. You'll always find a job as a bookkeeper somewhere. He never once asked about my passion for market analysis or my theories on investment strategy. To him, finance was for the people in the back rooms, counting other people's money. After college, the narrative became even more concrete. Vanessa got a high-profile marketing job for a luxury brand. Her life was a constant stream of social media posts from glamorous events, pictures with minor celebrities, and unboxings of expensive gifts. She met Mark, a lawyer from a family with old money, and her ascent was complete. She was their pride, the daughter they bragged about at the country club. I took a different path. I worked quietly at a mid-level investment firm, learning everything I could. I lived in a small, simple apartment in a modest neighborhood. I drove a reliable 10-year-old sedan. I didn't go on lavish vacations or buy designer clothes. I saved my money. I invested it. I was building something brick by quiet brick, but because it wasn't loud and flashy, my family assumed it didn't exist. Their assumptions weren't just passive, they were actively dismissive. Family dinners were the worst. Elizabeth, are you still driving that old thing? My father would ask, shaking his head with a sigh. A man judges a person by their car, you know. Mark just bought Vanessa the new Auden convertible for her birthday. My mother would chime in, her eyes gleaming. It's just divine. Vanessa would just smile, a practiced, sympathetic look on her face. Oh, Lizzie, you should let me take you shopping sometime. We could find you something professional. It's important to look the part, even if you're just, you know. She'd trail off, leaving the insult hanging in the air. Even if you're just a nobody. They called me the dependent one. When my refrigerator broke, I mentioned it offhand. My father immediately offered to loan me the money, not as a kind gesture, but as a performance for the rest of the family. Don't worry, he said loudly. We'll take care of you. I had the money, 10 times over, but I just said thank you and let him write the check. Arguing was pointless. It would only feed their story that I was difficult on top of being a failure. I was invited to this engagement party not out of love, but out of obligation. Or worse, as a prop. I was the dark background against which Vanessa's diamond could sparkle brighter. They needed someone to mock, someone to pity, to make their own success feel more complete. My presence served a purpose. I was the family beggar, there to remind everyone just how far the golden child had flown, and I let them. For years I let them. I swallowed the insults, endured the condescending remarks, and politely smiled through the humiliation. I told myself it was to keep the peace. I told myself that one day they would see me. That one day my success would speak for itself, but I was wrong. Success doesn't speak. Money doesn't speak. People only hear what they already believe. And my family believed I was nothing. What my family didn't know could have filled a library. While they were busy crafting their narrative of my failure, I was busy building an empire in silence. It started at that first mid-level investment firm. They underestimated me there, too. They saw a quiet woman who was good with numbers and gave me the grunt work. I spent my days analyzing portfolios for senior partners and my nights using what I learned to make my own small trades. I was careful. I was patient. I read every financial report, every market analysis, every footnote in every SEC filing I could get my hands on. My first big win was a small biotech startup nobody was watching. I invested a few $1,000s, my entire savings at the time. 6 months later, they had a breakthrough, and my investment multiplied 20 times over. That was the seed money. I quit my job. I didn't tell my family. As far as they knew, I was still a bookkeeper. I used the money to start my own firm, Carter Holdings. It was just me in my small apartment with a laptop and a fierce, burning need to prove something. If only to myself. I didn't invest in flashy tech stocks or chase trends. I focused on tangible assets. I bought undervalued commercial real estate in up-and-coming neighborhoods. I acquired small, struggling but solid businesses, a regional catering company, a chain of boutique hotels, a corporate travel agency. My strategy was simple. Buy what is good but poorly managed and make it better. I worked 18-hour days. I lived and breathed balance sheets and logistics. Within 5 years, Carter Holdings was no longer just me and a laptop. It was a private equity firm with a small, brilliant team and a portfolio worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I was the sole owner, the quiet, unseen force behind it all. I didn't put my face in magazines. I didn't do interviews. The world of high finance knew my company's name, but not mine. I preferred the anonymity. It was my shield, and it allowed me to conduct a quiet experiment with my family. The irony was thick enough to choke on. Every time they flaunted their wealth, they were really flaunting mine. That trip to Tuscany Vanessa bragged about for months? They stayed at Villa Rossi, one of the first boutique hotels my company acquired. I saw the booking come through. I told my staff to give them the best suite on the house. Vanessa posted a picture on Instagram captioned, "Living the good life. So blessed." That celebratory dinner for my father's 60th birthday at a Michelin-starred restaurant? The one they said I couldn't possibly afford, and graciously offered to cover my plate. The restaurant was supplied by a gourmet food distributor I owned. I saw the reservation. I called the manager and told him to charge the entire bill to my corporate account. My father paid with his credit card, and the next day, my company discreetly refunded the full amount back to him. He probably thought it was a bank error in his favor. He bragged about the incredible service for weeks. Steak dinners, spa weekends, front row tickets to shows. I quietly arranged for it all. I saw it as a strange, twisted form of care. My parents were proud and would never admit they were struggling to keep up with the lifestyle they felt they deserved. My father's firm was smaller than he let on, so I propped them up from the shadows. I paid their bills without them ever knowing. At first, it was about keeping the peace. It was easier to pay for things myself than to endure their pitying looks when I said I couldn't afford to join them. But over time, it became something else. It became a test. How far would they push their narrative? How much would they take, all while calling me a beggar? How blind were they? The answer was, completely. The Rosemont Hotel, the venue for Vanessa's grand engagement party, was the crown jewel of my portfolio. I had bought the entire hotel chain 2 years ago. When Vanessa announced her engagement and said they had booked the Rosemont ballroom, I felt a cold knot in my stomach. She gushed about how exclusive it was, how they had to pull strings to get a reservation. The truth was, my assistant had flagged the booking request from my father. I approved it myself. I gave them the venue at a 90% discount, masked as a promotional rate. So when I walked into that ballroom, I wasn't just walking into my sister's party. I was walking into my own building. The staff who nodded politely, the chefs in the kitchen, the valet parking the expensive cars out front, they all worked for me. My family saw me as an uninvited guest, a charity case in a navy dress. They had no idea they were the guests in my house. The party was an ordeal from the moment I arrived. I moved through the crowd, an invisible ghost in my own machine. People's eyes slid right past me. When I tried to join a conversation with my aunt and uncle, they gave me tight, polite smiles and quickly turned back to their discussion about renovating their summer home. I was a social dead end. I found a small table near the edge of the room and nursed a glass of sparkling water, watching the scene unfold. Vanessa was radiant, laughing and twirling in a dress that probably cost more than my car. Mark, her fiancé, stood beside her, his arm possessively around her waist. He had the easy, arrogant confidence of a man who had never faced a real obstacle in his life. He caught my eye once, giving me a dismissive little nod, as if acknowledging the staff. Dinner was a masterclass in subtle humiliation. I was seated at the worst table, stuck between a distant great aunt who couldn't hear a word I said, and a bitter second cousin who complained all night about his own failed business ventures. Every course that arrived, the seared scallops, the filet mignon, the decadent chocolate lava cake, was a product of my catering company. The food was exquisite. It was a menu I had personally approved. As my cousin complained about the steak being slightly overcooked, I just nodded and said nothing. The speeches were the main event. My father stood up first, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke about his perfect daughter, Vanessa. He talked about her beauty, her ambition, her brilliant choice in a husband. He never mentioned my name. It was as if he only had one child. Then, Mark, the fiancé, took the microphone. He raised his glass, a smug grin spreading across his face. "I want to propose a toast," he said, his voice booming through the speakers. "To my beautiful bride, Vanessa, who is not only the love of my life but an inspiration. She showed us all what real success looks like." His eyes scanned the room, and for a split second, they landed on me. The smirk deepened. The message was clear. This is success, not whatever it is you do. A wave of polite applause rippled through the hall. I felt a familiar hot sting behind my eyes, but I blinked it away. I was used to being erased. But then my mother, Helen, leaned into the microphone. Her voice was soft and sweet, laced with poison. "She really is an inspiration," she said, smiling lovingly at Vanessa. "Unlike poor Elizabeth, who still can't seem to hold down a proper job." The comment landed like a stone in a silent pond. It was direct. It was cruel. It was for the whole room to hear. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Vanessa just beamed, soaking it in. My father chuckled beside her, shaking his head as if it were all a charming family joke. He leaned toward the microphone and added the final nail in the coffin. "Ah, Lizzie," he said with a sigh that was pure performance. "Always begging for scraps." And that was it. That was the moment. The words hit me harder than the public declaration to throw me out. Begging for scraps. After years of secretly funding their lives, of paying for their vacations, their dinners, their parties, this party, that was how they saw me. A dog waiting for leftovers from their table. It wasn't anger that I felt in that instant. It was a profound, hollow clarity. A dam inside me that had been holding back years of quiet pain and swallowed pride didn't just crack, it vanished. Something in me snapped, not with a shout, but with a deafening, cold silence. I realized they would never see me. Not because they couldn't, but because they didn't want to. My failure was essential to their story of success. I stood up. My hands were steady. My heart was calm. The hurt was still there, but it had finally crystallized into something else. Something hard and clear. It was time to end the story. I didn't make a scene. I didn't cry or yell. That was their style, not mine. I simply placed my napkin on the table, pushed my chair back quietly, and excused myself. No one at my table even noticed I was gone. I walked out of the ballroom. The contrast was immediate. The muffled sounds of laughter and music faded behind me, replaced by the quiet, carpeted hush of the hotel lobby. The air here was cool and calm. I felt my breathing even out. The chaotic storm of emotion inside me settled into a single point of purpose. I walked past the grand floral arrangement in the center of the lobby, my reflection moving across the polished marble floor. I looked composed. No one would guess that a woman's entire relationship with her family had just died a few feet away. I found a quiet alcove near the concierge desk, pulled out my phone, and scrolled to a single number in my contacts. Amelia. Amelia was my assistant, my second in command. She was brilliant, efficient, and fiercely loyal. She knew everything about my business and by extension the strange, secret life I led. She answered on the first ring. "Miss Carter," she said. Her voice was crisp and professional, as always. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine, Amelia," I said, my own voice steady and calm. It didn't even waver. "I have a few directives for you. Please execute them immediately." "Of course." I could hear the faint sound of typing as she opened the necessary files on her end. First, the catering account for the Carter-Hayes engagement party at the Rosemont. Cancel all services effective immediately. They've already been served the main course. There will be no dessert, no late-night snacks, and no more drinks. Shut down the bar. "Understood," Amelia said without a hint of surprise. Catering account suspended. Second, freeze the master account for the ballroom and all associated event services. That includes the music, the lighting, and any staff charges from this point forward. "Done, Ms. Carter. The event account is now frozen." "Finally," I said, taking a slow breath. "The honeymoon package booked for Vanessa Carter and Mark Hayes through our travel agency. First-class flights to Bora Bora and the presidential suite at the Four Seasons. Revoke it. Cancel the tickets and the reservation. Effective immediately." There was a brief pause on the line. I could picture Amelia, her expression unreadable. She was the only one who knew the full extent of my family's dependence on me. "Yes, Miss Carter," she said. Her voice was still perfectly professional, but I thought I detected a faint note of satisfaction. "Flights and hotel are canceled." "Thank you, Amelia." "That's all?" I hung up the phone. "One call, 5 minutes." That's all it took to dismantle the perfect, glittering world they had built on my silent generosity. I stood there for a moment in the quiet lobby. I didn't feel vengeful or triumphant. I just felt light. The crushing weight of their expectations, their disappointments, their complete and utter blindness was gone. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their love, trying to be seen. Now, I was done. I knew it would take about 15 minutes for the gears to grind to a halt. 15 minutes until their perfect night began to collapse around them. I turned and walked back toward the ballroom, not as a beggar, but as the owner. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped back into the ballroom. The atmosphere was unchanged, a perfect bubble of oblivious celebration. The string quartet was playing a light, cheerful piece, and the air was thick with the scent of lilies and warm bread. Laughter and the clinking of glasses still filled the room. No one noticed my re-entry. To them, I was still the insignificant ghost who had slipped away from the corner table. My family was at the head table holding court. My father was telling a loud, boisterous story to Mark's parents, his face flushed with wine and self-importance. My mother was smiling serenely, a perfect hostess, while Vanessa basked in the glow of being the center of everyone's universe. They were so blissfully, arrogantly unaware of the precipice on which they stood. I found a new position, not at my sad little table in the back, but near a marble column closer to the center of the room, partially obscured, but with a clear view of the head table. I leaned against it, my arms crossed, and I waited. The first 5 minutes felt like an eternity. I watched as a waiter approached a guest's table with a bottle of champagne, only to be quietly intercepted by the maître d', a distinguished, silver-haired man named Jean-Pierre. A quiet word was exchanged. The waiter nodded, his expression professionally blank, and retreated without opening the bottle. The guests looked momentarily confused but were quickly distracted by their conversation. It was the first tremor, unnoticed by most. Then I saw it happen at the bar. A well-dressed man, one of my father's business associates, confidently ordered a scotch. The bartender, a young man I had personally commended for his excellent service in a quarterly review, politely shook his head. "I'm very sorry, sir," I could just barely hear him say, "but all beverage service has been suspended for this event." The man looked indignant. "Suspended? What on earth are you talking about?" The bartender simply repeated his apology, his face an unreadable mask of professional regret. The man scoffed and walked away, muttering to his wife. A small ripple of confusion began to spread from the bar. More guests were being politely refused. The quiet buzz of contentment was beginning to be pierced by notes of irritation and bewilderment. My family, however, remained cocooned in their bubble of importance. They hadn't needed to go to the bar. Their glasses were kept perpetually full by attentive staff. But now I noticed their glasses were empty, and no one was coming to refill them. My mother subtly tried to catch a waiter's eye, a small frown appearing on her perfectly made-up face. The staff, under Jean-Pierre's direction, expertly avoided her gaze. Her frown deepened. This was a breach of the perfect service she believed they were entitled to. After exactly 12 minutes by the clock on my phone, Jean-Pierre began his long, deliberate walk from the entrance of the ballroom toward the head table. He moved with a calm, unhurried grace that somehow made the situation feel even more significant. He was not a man who brought trivial matters to the host of a party. As he approached, the conversation at the head table faltered. My father looked up, annoyed at the interruption. "Yes, what is it?" he asked, his tone brusque. Jean-Pierre bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect that was simultaneously formal and completely impersonal. "Mr. Carter, my apologies for the interruption." His voice was quiet but carried clearly in the growing lull of the room. "There appears to be an issue with the account linked to this event." My father's face began to darken. "An issue? What kind of issue?" "I settled the deposit myself. It was a substantial one, I assure you." He said this last part loudly, for the benefit of those at the surrounding tables. "Indeed, sir," Jean-Pierre replied smoothly. "However, the account has been suspended by the owner of the hospitality group. As a result, we can no longer provide any further food, beverage, or entertainment services until this matter is resolved." The effect of his words was instantaneous. Gasps rippled through the nearby tables. Vanessa's face, which had been glowing with bridal bliss, went pale, a mask of horrified confusion. Mark's smug smile vanished, replaced by a look of sharp, analytical concern. My mother looked as though she might faint. My father, however, exploded. He slammed his hand down on the table, making the silverware jump. "Suspended by whom? Who dares interrupt my daughter's night? This is the Rosemont! I demand to speak to whoever is in charge. This is an outrage!" His voice boomed across the ballroom, and now all conversation ceased. The string quartet faltered into silence. Every single eye in the room was fixed on the head table, on my father's furious, reddening face. Jean-Pierre did not flinch. He stood perfectly still, a beacon of calm in the face of my father's tantrum. He waited for the outburst to finish, then replied in that same infuriatingly level tone. "The directive comes directly from the owner, sir. She is the one who has suspended the account." My father was practically sputtering with rage. "She? Who is she? I want a name. Is this some kind of shakedown? Because I assure you, you have picked the wrong family to—" He was cut short as Jean-Pierre slowly, deliberately turned his head. His gaze swept past the shocked faces at the head table, across the sea of stunned guests, and landed directly on me, standing by the marble column. He then made a small, elegant gesture with his hand, a simple indication in my direction. "She is right there, sir," Jean-Pierre said, his voice now clear and resonant in the dead silence of the room. "She does." A collective gasp went through the ballroom. Hundreds of heads swiveled in unison, following Jean-Pierre's gesture. Hundreds of pairs of eyes, confused, shocked, curious, all landed on me. The ghost in the corner, the beggar in the plain navy dress. For the first time all night, everyone saw me. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to absorb all sound. It was broken only by the faint, shocked gasps of the guests. Every eye was locked on me. A sea of faces turning from the drama at the head table to the quiet, unassuming woman by the pillar. In that moment, I was no longer invisible. I was the center of a universe that had, for my entire life, refused to acknowledge my existence. I saw my family's faces, a perfect tableau of disbelief. My father's jaw was slack, his enraged expression frozen into one of pure, uncomprehending confusion. My mother's hand was at her throat, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. And Vanessa just stared, her face a pale mask of bewilderment, as if her brain simply could not process the information it was receiving. I pushed myself off the marble column, my movements slow and deliberate. My heart was pounding, a steady, powerful drum against my ribs, not with fear, but with a cold, electrifying surge of adrenaline. The sound of my simple heels clicking on the marble floor seemed to echo in the cavernous silence as I began to walk toward the head table. It was the longest walk of my life. With each step, I felt the years of humiliation, of being overlooked, of biting my tongue, begin to burn away. I was no longer the shy, awkward girl hoping for a crumb of affection. I was a woman walking into the center of her power. I kept my eyes fixed on my family, watching their expressions shift in real time. Confusion gave way to a flicker of angry denial in my father's eyes. My mother's horror was morphing into a desperate social panic. Vanessa's look was the most telling. It was pure, unadulterated shock, the look of someone whose entire reality has just been shattered. Mark, the slick, confident lawyer, was already calculating, his eyes darting between me and my father, trying to understand the new power dynamic that had just exploded into existence. I stopped directly in front of the table, leaving a few feet of space between us. I was no longer a guest at their party. I was an authority they now had to face. I looked at each of them in turn, letting the silence stretch, forcing them to truly see me, perhaps for the very first time. Then I spoke. My voice was calm, steady, and clear. It carried through the silent room without any effort at all. "Allow me to reintroduce myself," I began, my gaze sweeping across my family's stunned faces before moving out to the captivated audience of their friends and associates. "Most of you know me as Elizabeth Carter, the quiet one, the unsuccessful one." I paused, letting the words hang in the air, the very labels they had so carefully applied to me for years. "But you have been operating under a misapprehension. I'm also the majority owner of Rosemont Holdings, the parent company that owns this hotel." A wave of murmurs and whispers erupted from the guests. Chairs scraped. Utensils clattered against plates. "That's not possible," Vanessa stammered, finding her voice for the first time. It was a weak, breathless whisper. "You're lying." I turned my cool gaze to her. "Am I?" I reached into the simple clutch I was carrying, the one my mother had called pathetically plain earlier in the evening. From it, I pulled out a slim leather folder. I opened it, and with a calm, deliberate motion, I laid a document on the table in front of my father. It was the deed of acquisition for the Rosemont Hotel chain, with my signature, Elizabeth Carter, clear and bold at the bottom. I didn't stop there. I pulled out another document and laid it beside the first. "I also own Gourmet Gatherings, the catering service that provided every bite of food you've eaten tonight." I looked directly at my cousin, the one who had complained about his steak. He visibly shrank in his seat. "And," I continued, placing a third document on the growing pile, "I own Global Journeys, the travel agency that booked your honeymoon to Bora Bora." I looked at Vanessa again, whose face had now lost all color. Her dream honeymoon, the one she had described in excruciatingly lavish detail to anyone who would listen, was a gift from the sister she had just spent the entire evening mocking. The proof was there, undeniable, printed in black and white on official letterhead. My father stared at the papers, his face a mottled shade of red and white. He looked from my signature to my face and back again, his mind unable to bridge the chasm between the beggar he thought he knew and the powerful woman standing before him. "Every bill you bragged about me begging for?" I said, my voice dropping slightly but losing none of its intensity. "I paid. The family vacations you thought you were so generously funding, my hotels, the celebratory dinners you used to flaunt your success, my restaurants. The very deposit for this party, Father, was refunded to your credit card 3 weeks ago by my accounting department." I let that last piece of information sink in. The one tangible proof of his generosity, the substantial deposit he had boasted about, was a lie. He had paid nothing. He had contributed nothing. He was a guest here just like everyone else, a guest whose host he had just tried to have thrown out. My gaze swept over them one last time, my sputtering father, my horrified mother, my shattered sister, and her calculating fiancé. The power in the room had shifted so completely, so irrevocably, it was almost a physical force. The story they had told about me, the one that had defined my life, had just been utterly and completely destroyed. I leaned forward slightly, my voice a quiet, final pronouncement. "Every glass of champagne you drank tonight?" It was on my tab. "And tonight," I said, standing up straight again, a feeling of immense, cleansing power washing over me, "I'm closing it." The immediate aftermath of my declaration was a symphony of chaos. The shocked whispers from the guests crescendoed into a loud, buzzing murmur that filled the entire ballroom. People were no longer trying to be discreet. They were openly staring, pointing, and talking amongst themselves. Some looked at me with a newfound, almost fearful respect. Others looked at my family with a mixture of pity and schadenfreude, the morbid delight of watching the mighty fall from their pedestal. The carefully constructed facade of the perfect, powerful Carter family had just been sledgehammered into dust in front of all their friends, business associates, and rivals. My father, after a moment of stunned, speechless paralysis, finally found his voice again. It was a choked, strangled sound of pure rage. "This is a joke," he snarled, shoving the papers on the table away from him as if they were contaminated. "This is some kind of elaborate, sick joke. You think you can come in here and what? Forge some documents to embarrass us?" He looked around wildly, seeking allies, but found only a sea of curious, judgmental faces. His power, the kind built on bluster and a carefully maintained image, was useless here. The evidence was irrefutable. My mother, ever the social strategist, tried a different tactic. She rose slowly from her chair, her face a carefully constructed mask of pained maternal love. She reached a hand out toward me, her voice trembling slightly for dramatic effect. "Elizabeth, sweetheart, you're just misunderstanding," she cooed, her voice loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "We've always known you were resourceful, This is just your way of contributing. A surprise! We're so proud of you, darling, but you're making a scene. It was a desperate, pathetic attempt to reclaim the narrative, to paint me as an emotional, confused child who had taken a generous surprise the wrong way. She was trying to smooth it over, to wrap this catastrophic revelation in a blanket of social niceties and pretend it was all just a misunderstanding. For a moment, the old Elizabeth, the one conditioned to seek peace at any cost, almost wavered. But then I looked at her eyes, and I saw no love, no pride. I saw only cold, hard panic, the panic of a woman whose reputation was being destroyed. I cut her off with a single sharp word. No. The word was quiet, but it sliced through her placating tone like a shard of glass. I took a step closer to the table, and for the first time, my voice was no longer just calm. It was filled with the cold, hard weight of 2 decades of repressed truth. There is no misunderstanding. For years, I have sat silently while you used me as your family punchline. I was your prop, the sad little failure you could point to in order to make yourselves feel bigger, more successful. You mocked me, you dismissed me, you erased me from your lives unless you needed someone to pity. I looked directly at my father. You called me a beggar tonight in front of everyone. But who is the real beggar, father? The one who builds an empire on her own? Or the one who unknowingly lives off the charity of the child he scorns? I turned to my mother. You worried that I couldn't hold a proper job. Was this what you had in mind? Because while you were busy worrying about my social standing, I was busy signing the paychecks for the staff you've been ordering around all evening. Finally, I looked at Vanessa. Her face was streaked with tears, her perfect makeup ruined. Her dream night had turned into a public nightmare. You thought success was a designer dress and a rich fiancé, I said, my voice softening slightly, not with pity, but with a profound sense of finality. You never once asked me about my life, my work, my passions. You just assumed. You all just assumed because it was easier. It was easier to believe I was a failure than to accept that I had built something beyond your comprehension. My father's rage, which had been simmering, finally boiled over. He shot up from his chair, his movement so violent that the chair itself scraped backward and toppled over with a loud crash. You ungrateful brat, he roared, his face a terrifying shade of purple. After everything we've done for you, we gave you everything. We paid for your education. We supported you. And this is how you repay us? By trying to ruin your sister's life? You are no daughter of mine! His words, which once would have shattered me, now felt hollow. They were the desperate, empty threats of a king whose castle had just crumbled to the ground. In contrast to his explosive rage, I remained perfectly still, calm, and unmoved. My power wasn't in shouting. It was in the quiet, unshakable truth. I didn't need to yell back. My actions, the silent, methodical dismantling of their world, had already spoken volumes. The entire room was watching, a captive audience to the raw, ugly truth of my family's dynamics. The performance was over. The masks were off, and all that was left was the fallout. I held my father's furious gaze for a long moment, letting his words echo in the silent room. I felt nothing. No pain, no anger, not even sadness. Just a vast, empty space where my love for him used to be. The connection had been severed. You're right, I said softly, my voice carrying a chilling finality. You supported the person you thought I was, the person you needed me to be. You have no idea who I am. I then delivered the final devastating blow, the one that summed up the entire night, the entire relationship. Tonight, you all learn what happens when the beggar you spit on owns the ground under your feet. My father stood there, trembling with impotent rage, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no more words came out. He had fired his final, loudest salvo, and it had glanced off me without leaving a mark. The sight of his powerlessness seemed to stun him into silence. My mother had sunk back into her chair, her face buried in her hands, a portrait of social ruin. Vanessa was openly sobbing, her body shaking with hiccuping cries, while Mark stood stiffly beside her, his face a cold, calculating mask. He was already reassessing his future, distancing himself from the wreckage of his fiancé's family. I had said everything I needed to say. There was nothing left but to close the final chapter. I turned my back on my sputtering father, a final, complete, and irreversible dismissal. It was the most liberating act of my life. I no longer needed his approval, his anger, his attention of any kind. He was irrelevant. My gaze found Jean-Pierre, the maitre d', who had been standing by, a silent, professional observer to the entire implosion. He met my eyes with a look of calm, unwavering respect. He was waiting for his orders. I gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Jean-Pierre, I said, my voice returning to the quiet, authoritative tone of a CEO, not a wounded daughter. Please escort my family. Please escort the Carter family out of the building. Their account is closed. Their presence here is no longer welcome. Yes, Ms. Carter, he replied without a moment's hesitation. He turned and, with a subtle gesture, summoned 2 of the security guards who had been hovering discreetly near the ballroom doors. The young guard who had initially approached me with pity in his eyes was one of them. Now he looked at me with something akin to awe. My final command hung in the air, a sentence of social execution. The guests began to stir, some with a sense of morbid fascination, others with genuine discomfort, starting to gather their things. Eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere of raw family drama, I didn't wait to watch the humiliating spectacle of their removal. I didn't need to. The image was already seared into my mind. I simply turned and began to walk toward the exit, the same grand doors I had walked through only hours before as a nervous, invisible guest. My exit was as powerful as my reveal. I walked with a steady, unhurried pace, my back straight, my head held high. I didn't look back. I didn't need to see their faces to know the depth of their shock and humiliation. I could feel every eye in the room on my back, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a spotlight I had earned. The sound of my father's voice, finally breaking free from his stunned silence, cracked through the air behind me. It was no longer a roar of authority, but the desperate, cracking shriek of a man who had lost everything. You'll regret this, Elizabeth. You'll come crawling back. You'll have nothing. No one. You'll be alone. His words trailed after me, a pathetic, dying echo of the power he once held over me. But the truth was, I already knew what it was to be alone. I had been alone my entire life, even when surrounded by family. The difference was, now I was free. As I walked, my mind was surprisingly clear. It wasn't filled with thoughts of revenge or triumph. It was filled with a profound, quiet sense of release. It felt like I had been carrying 100-pound weight on my shoulders for 32 years, and I had just set it down. A flood of memories washed over me, not with pain, but with a strange sense of detachment, like watching scenes from someone else's life. I saw myself as a little girl, waiting by the window for a father who was always too busy for her. I saw myself as a teenager, listening to my mother praise Vanessa while I faded into the wallpaper. I saw myself as a young woman, biting my tongue at yet another condescending remark at a family dinner. Each memory was a link in a long, heavy chain, and with every step I took toward the door, I felt another link break. What had I lost tonight? A fantasy. The desperate, childish hope that one day my family would wake up and finally see me, love me, and be proud of me. That hope had been a poison, keeping me tethered to their cruelty. And what had I gained? Myself, my name, my truth. I reached the grand doors of the ballroom and pushed them open. The cool, quiet air of the lobby greeted me like a long-lost friend. I didn't stop. I walked across the marble floor, past the front desk where the staff now watched me with undisguised deference, and out through the main entrance of the hotel. The night air was crisp and clean. The city lights twinkled in the distance. I stood on the steps of my hotel, the sounds of the city a comforting hum around me. My father's final threat echoed in my mind. You'll be alone. But the truth was, I had never felt less alone. For the first time, I felt light. I felt free. I felt like Elizabeth Carter, and that was more than enough. The next morning, I woke up in my own apartment, the one they always called small and sad. The sun was streaming through the large windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was quiet. The silence wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of my family's disapproval. It was a peaceful, clean silence. My silence. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, looking out over the city. My phone, which I had expected to be exploding with angry voicemails and manipulative texts, was silent. They hadn't called. Not my father to rage, not my mother to guilt trip, not Vanessa to weep. Nothing. And in that silence, I understood a profound truth. They never would. To apologize, to even engage, would be to admit that their entire worldview, the one that had sustained them for decades, was a lie. And they were too cowardly for that. Later that day, Amelia sent me a link. It wasn't to a gossip column or a society page detailing the scandal of the season. It was an article in the most respected business journal in the country. The headline read, Rosemont Holdings CEO Elizabeth Carter makes power move, restructures key assets. The article detailed in dry financial terms the sudden strategic overhaul of several of Carter Holdings' subsidiaries. It mentioned the suspension of services at a high-profile event as a decisive move to assert owner control. Not one reporter called me a beggar. Not one word was mentioned of family drama. They called me a visionary. They called me a shrewd investor. They called me Elizabeth Carter. My story, the one I had written in silence for years, was finally the one being told. My family never did apologize. They never could. The few times I saw them at unavoidable public functions over the years, they would look right through me, their faces cold and blank. They had simply erased me from their reality, the same way they had tried to erase me from their family photos. But I didn't need their apology. I didn't need their recognition. Their silence was the greatest gift they had ever given me. I had spent my life begging for their love, but that night, I learned that begging gets you scraps, and I was done with scraps. I'd already chosen my own silence over their noise, and my own peace over the exhausting war of proving myself, because sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't revenge at all. It's living well and quietly in the empire they said you'd never build. Call to action. Have you ever been underestimated by your own family? Drop your story in the comments. Like if you know silence can be the loudest revenge. Subscribe for more stories where the so-called failures rise higher than anyone imagined.